So I hope you appreciate that about him. Okay, drama in general. So I just want to talk about drama is different than prose, which is short story fiction, narrative writing, and poetry, right? So it's just different. So here are some things that make it different. Okay, so prose, fiction, nonfiction. You tend to have a narrator with a plot and characters and setting. It's meant to be read in your head, not out loud. It is driven by narration, so not the characters speaking to each other, but what's happening, what are they doing. The author is usually really visible through the tone and voice of the narrative. Okay. The novel actually is a fairly new phenomenon. I want to talk about this because it kind of relates to drama. Novel comes from the transliteration of the Italian word novella, which describes a short, compact, realistic tale popular during the medieval period. Okay, so these are the things that give rise to Shakespeare. They give rise to drama as we know it today. Drama looked much different before this. There was a big outcry for drama because the middle class had more time to do things like read because of technology and industrialization. Okay, we get the printing press, and so that allows us to produce novels quickly and cheaply. Also, libraries become a thing, and so you don't have to buy them; you can just borrow them. People are already reading things like autobiographies and biographies. Novels, adding in that fiction piece, was just kind of a natural transition. And so we get this humanist movement to study man and mankind, which of course you'll see in Hamlet as well. The early English novel moves away from the idea of allegory and romance, and it tries to be much more realistic. More pragmatic. It's a lot more about morality and struggles with moral issues, which even though Hamlet is not a novel, you will see a lot of these similar characteristics. Pamela by Samuel Richardson is considered the first real English novel. Ben Franklin actually reprinted it in America in 1742. But it doesn't really take off because he's a British writer and the Americans weren't really, into the British at that point in time, if you know your history. That we weren't necessarily getting along. And so it doesn't really take off in America, the novel, until we get Hawthorne, Melville, and Cooper, really into the 1840s, 1850s, shortly before the Civil War. So, just some things about novel, and all of that is, related to Hamlet. Okay, so still talking about prose specifically, the novel deals with a human character in a social situation. There's a lot of emphasis on character in the novel, and one of the things that happens with the English novel is it's much more about real life and real people, about being authentic. Okay, so a traditional novel has a unified and plausible plot, so a plot that focuses on specifically one overarching idea that is possible. Okay, very believable, individualistic characters, and at least some illusion of reality that this could actually happen. Originally, we defined a work of prose as something over 50,000 words. That was until short story becomes really popular. Okay. So then also drama. We can thank the Greeks for drama. In 1534, Thespis jumped on the back of a cart pretending to be a character, and he was saying lines of poetry because a lot of drama is poetry, and that's how drama was born. Aeschylus added more than one speaking role, and that really brings in a play because now we have more than one character, and so we add in things like conflict and stuff like that. Aristotle wrote about drama in his writing The Poetics, which then defined drama and it really becomes the first discussion of dramatic theory. So what makes drama? What are the best characteristics of drama? So Aristotle really gets to define drama for us. Okay. So then some characteristics of drama specifically. Know that there are different types of drama. So comedy. And by the way, comedy doesn't always have to be happy. Sometimes it's more satirical. So it's actually just making fun of people, satire. There are two different kinds of comedy, high comedy and low comedy. High comedy is a lot more about social satire, and it uses pretty highbrow jokes that appeal to an educated crowd. So, for our example, think Big Bang Theory. Okay, a TV show like that. Low comedy is much more about like body jokes, physical humor, not necessarily educated. This is more like the Three Stooges. Okay. The satyr play, these were really short plays that were performed in the middle of tragedies to sort of lighten the mood in between acts. And really, it made fun of the tragedy's characters. So this is something you probably would have seen at, for instance, Hamlet. They would have had these satyr plays in the middle between the acts as like a break. Okay, sort of an intermission. And then, of course, tragedy. This is the big one that we're going to focus on because that's what Hamlet is. And, you know, Shakespeare writes a lot of tragedy, but also know that Shakespeare wrote a whole lot of comedy as well. And we don't get a lot of that in high school, and, you know, we won't cover one in this particular class. But I'll be very honest and say that I personally think that that Shakespeare's comedies are probably better than his tragedies. It's not a popular opinion, but it's one I have. Okay. Tragedy, to be a tragedy, it has to have a couple of things. First of all, it has to deal with the big themes of life: love, loss, pride, power, things like that. Usually the main protagonist commits some terrible crime without realizing that it was a really stupid thing to do. We will also see that in Hamlet. As he realizes his error, the world just sort of falls apart around him because of this mistake he's made. We will see that in Hamlet. The three great playwrights of tragedy, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These Greek writers really start the idea of tragedy. Of course, tragedy ends with death, or a lot of death. And if you've read Julius Caesar or Romeo and Juliet, you know that that is a very true thing to say. However, that is the fact that there's death is not necessarily what makes something a tragedy. There are comedies that have death in them. So death in and of itself does not make a play a tragedy. So keep that in mind. Aristotle in Poetics argued that tragedy cleansed the heart, so that we live through pity and terror and things like that, sort of purges all of that out of our soul so that we can be good people. He calls it catharsis. And so that's where we kind of get that term from. And I think that's interesting. The last type is a history play. And this is something that Shakespeare is fantastic at. He starts writing these about the Henrys. So some of the kings of England. He writes a couple of others. Even after that, he writes one about Richard. So Shakespeare does those. Those become very political. Those plays, you have to remember Elizabeth is the queen when Shakespeare is writing a lot of his stuff. And so even though these plays are about kings long dead, he's using them to make political statements to England in that day and to the queen. Okay, so that's one great thing about the history plays is you can see it on two levels. The history of the ruler being discussed, but also how it pertained to present day England that he was writing in. History tends to fall under tragedy because, well, history can be pretty sad. It didn't appear until Renaissance England. Okay, so Shakespeare really is the one who pioneers this. He and Edmund Spenser. You get history is a pretty new one. What makes drama different than the others is that drama is intended to be acted out. So when you're reading Hamlet, make sure that in your mind you're picturing what this would look like on the stage. Okay. The story relies heavily on characters. There typically is not a narrator. The plot is not given by narration. It happens through dialogue and action. So you got to be very, very careful to pay attention to the dialogue because it will give you the action. Okay. Very little setting happens, props and stage direction. So they would have put props out, but especially in Shakespeare's time, it would have been very minimal. You had to use your imagination as an audience member. Okay. Costumes and lighting and things like that also help. A modern day play, though, maybe you've seen something at a school, even those are probably way more elaborate in their props and staging and lighting and stuff like that than anything Shakespeare would have had. So, it really depends on dialogue and good acting to have a good drama. Okay, and so drama has little to no narration. Poetry uses a persona. Fiction uses a narrator. Okay, so this is how some of these things are different. Drama gives setting through props. Poetry doesn't really depend on setting at all. And fiction relies really heavy on setting, but we get it through narrative. Fiction and drama tend to have some structure, while poetry can be very structured or very unstructured. Okay, so that one, they all work a little differently. Fiction and drama have plot and action. Poetry is more about emotion and capturing the moment, although, of course, there is poetry that does also have narrative. Okay, so there's a little bit about drama generally.